Today's case was actually suggested by my mum, and it's going to be a pretty long video because it's one of those cases where the official story seems pretty clear cut, but when you dig deeper there are so many unanswered questions and maybe everything is not as it seems. I really wanted to do a comprehensive analysis of this case, so I included every detail that I found that I thought was relevant in some way. If you enjoy mysteries, true crime, disappearances and conspiracies, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. I also have a Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel and accessing some bonus content, a link for that will be in the description. Or if you just want to make a one-time donation, I'll also leave a link to my PayPal. Richard John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, commonly known as Lord Lucan, was born on the 18th of December 1973 in London, England. After being evacuated as a child during World War II, he returned to attend Eton College, then served in the army for 2 years before a short career in merchant banking. He developed an interest in gambling, which would end up significantly contributing to many of his problems later in life. In 1960, he became known as Lucky Lucan after winning £26,000 in 48 hours, which sounds a lot now but would have been even more back in those days. He decided to take up gambling as a career and was an early member of the Claremont Club, which was an exclusive group of rich British gamblers. Lord Lucan, or John as his friends called him, was known for his expensive tastes. He raced powerboats and drove an Aston Martin. With the money he'd earned from gambling, he'd certainly become accustomed to the finer things in life. In 1963, he married Veronica Duncan, we'll call her V, and they moved in together close to the Claremont Club. Sometime after, John's boat sank during a competition, resulting in a £9,000 insurance payout. He lost £8,000 of that in one night gambling at the Claremont Club, while V watched from the other side of the room. This left him very short of cash. According to V, that £9,000 was all he had at that time, so he'd now be down to just £1,000. 6 weeks later, John's father died, and he not only inherited the title of Lord Lucan, but also a significant sum of money and land too. Between 1964 and 1970, the couple had 3 children, Francis, George and Camilla. V suffered severe postnatal depression after each birth and was treated with a variety of antidepressants that apparently affected her mental well-being over the years after. John was initially sympathetic to his wife, but eventually grew tired of her behaviour. By her own account, V admitted that she could have been a better mother. She spent a lot of time in bed and always had a nanny looking after the children. She was described as cold, but stated that all her relationships were cold, including her marriage. Despite their seemingly lavish lifestyle, V implied that her marriage wasn't particularly enjoyable. John's gambling career, which had basically turned into an addiction after a short while, caused money problems for them. She said that even though the couple went on many trips and did other things together, she always felt like she was alone when she was with him. During and after V's second pregnancy, she claimed that John was unpleasant to her, which caused her to develop feelings for one of his friends, Greville Howard, who was nice to her and always offered to do her favours. She claimed nothing happened between them, but it seemed that John realised something was going on, so might have spoken to Greville or warned him off, which resulted in his and V's friendship breaking down. After this, John became distant with V, which caused her to become depressed, and one day, without her knowledge, John made an appointment for her to see a psychiatrist, taking her there under the pretense that they were just going for a drive. It was decided that V could return home, but she was prescribed drugs that had side effects so bad that she couldn't sleep at night, resulting in John apparently giving her 4 times the recommended dose of sleeping pills. John again tried to get her admitted to a psychiatric hospital, but she ran away. She said she asked Greville to look for her if she disappeared, hinting that she feared for her own life. V claims that John was physically violent to her on around 3 occasions. One time he said he was going to beat the mad ideas out of her head and proceeded to strike her with a cane in what she described as measured blows, stating that he could have hit harder. She said that he was affectionate afterwards and seemed to regret what he'd done when he saw the marks. Another time, after an argument, John tried to strangle her, leaving marks which remained the next day. One day, after attempting to get her sectioned, John left the house and never returned. V accused him of desertion and hired a solicitor to help her get financial support from John. The couple ended up in court for a custody battle, with John claiming that V was mentally unstable and therefore unable to take care of the children. John had reportedly hired private investigators to look into V to find anything that could work in his favour in court. Recordings were played in court of arguments between the couple where V wasn't aware that she was being recorded. She admits to saying some terrible things to him, but his plan didn't work regardless, and she was granted custody of the children, as mothers usually were at that time, with John being allowed contact every other weekend and half of the holidays. This is just speculation on my part, but I do wonder if V only went for custody of the children to get back at John. Obviously, she suffered with postnatal depression, so I wouldn't blame her for how she acted shortly after her children were born, but in interviews years later, she still doesn't seem particularly maternal and was more than happy for nannies to take care of the children pretty much all of the time, even after the custody battle. When the children were away from her for any length of time, and she was asked if she missed them, she said she didn't, as she knew they were safe. It all just seemed to me that she wouldn't want any harm coming to her kids and that she did care about them, but that she wasn't particularly bothered about being a mother. Part of the court order was that a nanny had to be hired when V was looking after the children, and she hired 29-year-old Sandra Rivett. John's gambling problem became even worse after the custody battle. It seems that he didn't realise how much everything in relation to that would cost, and he got desperate, gambling in games where the odds were stacked against him. On the 7th of November 1974, V and her daughter Frances were watching TV in V's room when Sandra, the nanny, came in at around 8:55 p.m. to ask if she wanted a cup of tea. Other reports state that Sandra told V that she had put the children to bed at around 8:30 p.m. and then had gone down to make the tea, and then Frances came into V's bedroom. According to V, when Sandra didn't return, she went to check on her. V went downstairs and shouted down into the basement where the kitchen was, but before she could wait for a reply, she was attacked. The attacker hit her over the head with a lead pipe and told her to shut up, at which point she recognised the voice and realised who it was. It was her husband, John. The pair fought for a few moments until V managed to grab him in the area that it would hurt a lot for a man, and he let go of her. She managed to talk him down and convince him that she could help him hide the body and help him escape if he'd just wait in the house a few days until her wounds healed. He walked V upstairs into the bedroom, told Frances to go to bed, and got a towel to put down on the pillow for V to lay on. He gave her sleeping pills and went into the bathroom to wet a towel to clean her face, and at that moment V found the opportunity to escape. According to a BBC documentary, Murder in Belgravia, The Lucan Affair, which is available on YouTube if you want to watch it, the couple spent 40 minutes in the bedroom before V left. She ran out of the house and to a nearby pub, shouting that she'd just escaped from a murderer. Bar staff called an ambulance and the police, and V was taken to the hospital. When police arrived at the house, they had to kick down the front door to get in and noticed no signs of forced entry. A blood-stained towel was found in V's bedroom, and there was a significant amount of blood at the top of the stairs leading down to the kitchen, where a lead pipe was found nearby. There were signs of a struggle, the banister rail was damaged, and pictures hung on the walls were knocked out of place. The light bulb had been taken out in the kitchen and was on a chair nearby. At the bottom of the stairs in the kitchen, 2 cups and saucers were in a pool of blood, and Sandra's body had been placed in a canvas sack, which V later stated that she didn't recognise. Blood was found on the leaves in the rear garden, which is interesting because the garden wall was too high and overgrown to jump over, so why would anyone have been in the back garden? It was suggested that this blood may have been transferred by one of the pet cats, but no one knows for sure. The blood in the garden was only type B, so the cat would have to have picked up blood from the basement and avoided any of V's blood at the top of the stairs. Police searched John's home and found nothing suspicious. An outfit was laid out on the bed, and John's wallet, car keys, money, driving licence and glasses were on the bedside table, which also contained his passport. John's car was outside and the battery was flat. A couple of weeks prior, John had borrowed a car from his friend, possibly because he couldn't afford to drive his own car or because he knew he wouldn't be associated with his friend's car. Pathologist Keith Simpson's opinion was that the lead pipe found at the scene was the murder weapon. John's exact movements after the murder are not fully known, though he may have arrived at the home of Madeline Floorman, the mother of one of Frances's school friends, between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Because Madeline was alone in the house, she ignored the door but answered a call shortly after, in which the caller was incoherent, but she thought it could have been John. Spots of blood were found on her doorstep and later determined to be a mix of blood groups A and B. Obviously, back in the 70s, forensic science wasn't what it is today, and I think when it came to examining blood, they couldn't definitively prove that a blood sample came from a specific person, but they could determine if the blood group matched. So the blood on the doorstep was consistent with a mix of V and Sandra's blood. V's blood group was A and Sandra's was B. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m, John made a call to his mother. After this, he drove 45 miles to his friend Ian Maxwell Scott's house in Uckfield, Sussex. Ian was away for the night, but his wife Susan was home and she got out of bed to let John inside. While there, he made another call to his mother, telling her he would speak to the police the next morning. He also wrote 2 letters to his friend and brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kidd. Susan's daughter then posted them the next morning, and when Bill received them, he noticed there was blood on the back of the envelopes and took them straight to the police. One of the letters was notifying Bill how John's debts could be paid off, and the other read, "Dear Bill, the most ghastly circumstances arose tonight which I briefly described to my mother. When I interrupted the fight at Lower Belgrave Street and the man left, Veronica accused me of having hired him. I took her upstairs and sent Frances to bed and tried to clean her up. She lay doggo for a bit, and when I was in the bathroom she left the house. The circumstantial evidence against me is strong in that V will say it was all my doing. I will also lie doggo for a bit, but I am only concerned for the children. If you can manage it, I want them to live with you. Coutts, trustees, St Martin's Lane, Mr Wall will handle school fees. V has demonstrated her hatred for me in the past and would do anything to see me accused. For George and Frances to go through life knowing their father had stood in the dock for attempted murder would be too much. When they are old enough to understand, explain to them the dream of paranoia and look after them. Yours ever, John." After talking and writing the letters in Susan's company, he left, and that was the last time anyone has ever seen Lord Lucan. Nearly 50 years later, there have been countless sightings all around the world, but none have been confirmed to be John. The most popular theory to explain what happened that night is that John entered the house with the intention of killing V. He thought Sandra was V when she walked down into the kitchen in the dark. He apparently knew that Thursdays were Sandra's day off. Frances had told him that Sandra normally spent that day with her boyfriend, so John had no reason to believe that Sandra would be in the house that day. Aside from V's testimony, there is some, mostly circumstantial evidence to suggest that John might have murdered Sandra. The weapon was a lead pipe, but it had been wrapped up in a bandage or tape. V noted that it was similar to the cane that John had hit her with before. That too was wrapped up in the same way. The car that John had borrowed from his friend was found a 25 to 30 minute drive away from Ian and Susan's house, and bloodstains were found in it from the AB blood group. It's possible that the blood could have been a mix of V's, type A, and Sandra's, type B, though this wasn't proven. In the boot of the car, a lead pipe was found, similar to the weapon used but a bit bigger, still wrapped similar to the other, though the tape used to wrap both pipes could not be conclusively linked. An employee of the Claremont Club saw John outside the club that night at around 8:45 p.m. He asked the employee if his friends were inside. Police believe he did this to give himself an alibi. Greville Howard, who V admitted to falling in love with during her marriage, told police that John had suggested that a way out of his troubles was to kill V, and even discussed what he would do with the body. If that's true, and assuming it wasn't just a joke in very poor taste, it's very suspicious, but notice how these things always come out after a murder or attempted murder. If your friends seriously told you that they planned to murder their wife, even going into detail of where the body would be hidden, why wait until that person's dead before you report that conversation? Greville and John were friends, though I'm not sure how likely it is that John would tell Greville his plans to murder V, considering John was aware that he and V had fallen in love and he warned him off. Whether or not John would go to these lengths to solve his problems is debatable, but he did have a clear motive to want V gone. He was in serious debt at this point, and having to financially support V as well as pay for the nanny as ordered by the court was just putting him further and further in debt. He also fought for custody of his kids, and while he was granted contact, he did lose out on full custody. So him killing V would not only improve his financial situation, but it would give him another chance to go for full custody of his kids. In discussions about this case online, I've seen it theorised that John might have killed his father because the timing of his death is suspicious. He died within 6 weeks of John losing all his money, and John stood to inherit a significant amount of money and land. This is just a baseless theory though. John's dad died of a stroke, and to my knowledge there's no way that someone can induce a stroke in someone else, so I just wanted to clear that up. The timing of the death is purely coincidental. On the 13th of November 1974, an inquest into Sandra's death was opened. It was adjourned a couple of times and a full inquest was scheduled for the 16th of June 1975. The jury believed that John was guilty of murder. He was the last person to be committed by a coroner to the Crown Court for unlawful killing. As of 1977, coroners no longer have the power to do that. So this seems a pretty open and shut case. Obviously, John murdered Sandra thinking that she was V when she came down the stairs, and because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison, he either ran away or ended his own life. This seems to be the theory that the majority of people believe in this case, and while it might well be true, I don't personally believe it's quite so clear-cut. What is believed to be the true account of what happened that night mostly relies on V's testimony. There is some circumstantial evidence to back it up, but there are no other witnesses, and John's story is quite different. He told Susan when he visited that night that he walked or drove past V's house and witnessed an altercation between V and an unknown man. If he had driven past the house, he wouldn't have been able to see in that window, but he could have if he walked past. He ran into the house to help, but slipped in a pool of blood at the top of the basement stairs, and by the time he got up, the attacker had fled. It's important to note that the blood on the floor did not show evidence that anyone had slipped in it. V told him that Sandra was dead, and then apparently accused him of hiring a hitman to get rid of her. He told his mother a brief summary of those events on the phone that night, and implied that something like that had happened in the letters to Bill without going into detail. You might wonder what are the chances of John walking past the house and looking in at the exact moment that an attacker was trying to attack his wife. But according to his friend John Wilbraham, who had been staying with him for a few days before the murder, they would often walk past V's house, either on a walk or on their way to dinner, and John would always look into the windows just to make sure everything was okay. That does sound a bit weird, but considering John's kids lived there at the time, he was probably just being paranoid. And either way, it does make it less unusual that John would happen to walk past and witness what he did. There are conflicting reports on John's demeanour in the days prior to the murder. Most of his friends said that he seemed fine and was just acting normally. His friend Michael Hicks Beach saw John at around 6 PM that day, just about 3 hours before the murder took place. John asked Michael to take a look at the speech that he'd written that he was asked to give on gambling. Michael said that he didn't seem like someone that was just about to go and murder the nanny or his wife. However, George Weiss, a friend who played backgammon with John the day before the murder, claims that he was in a dark frame of mind. All his old confidence was gone. It was like he'd been completely traumatised over something. We'll get back to the possible reason for this soon. For V's testimony to be correct, John would have had to drive to the house, let himself in, sneak downstairs without anyone seeing him, remove the light bulb, and then kill Sandra within the space of around 10 minutes. John was seen at the Claremont Club at 8:45 PM, and V claimed Sandra went downstairs at 8:55 PM. The employee who saw John stated that he went with the police to do an experiment of how long the drive would take. They drove back and forth a few times, and the average time was about 10 minutes. V seems pretty sure that the time she gave was correct, seeing as a TV show she wanted to watch started at 9, and Sandra went down before this. The employee who saw John at the club also seemed pretty sure of the time he gave, and implied in the BBC documentary that he didn't think it would be possible for John to have left the club and murdered Sandra within those 10 minutes. It's possible his time could have been slightly off, but it's a pretty tight timeline. Francis gave police a pretty detailed account of that night, and claimed that Sandra had gone to the kitchen sometime before 8:40 PM. Obviously she was just a kid at the time, she could have been mistaken, but a TV show she watched finished at 8:30 PM, and she stated that she played with a game for about 5 to 10 minutes before going into V's room, and Sandra had already gone downstairs at this point. She's one of the few people in this case that would have no possible reason to lie, and even though she could have been off by a few minutes, we're talking a difference of at least 15 minutes here. Obviously neither source can be 100% reliable, but if we were to believe the club employees' times and Francis's times, then it seems very likely that Sandra was probably already dead by the time John arrived at the house. Maybe John hired a hitman. That would explain some of the inconsistencies with the timeline, and a hitman would be more likely to mistake Sandra for V rather than her husband. There was even a crazy rumour that circulated online a while back that John had hired Arnold Schwarzenegger to kill V. The rumour goes that when living in London for a period of time, Arnold made some extra cash by intimidating gamblers on behalf of debt collectors. Because of this, Arnold and John might have been acquainted, and John supposedly hired Arnold to kill V, probably paying him but also offering to help him get a green card so he could move to America. Obviously this theory is pretty ridiculous anyway, but as far as I could tell, Arnold wasn't living in London at the time of Sandra's murder. Aside from the Hitman theory explaining some of the discrepancies though, there are other things that just really don't make sense. Why would John even show up at the house at all if he'd just hired a hitman to take care of it? Why even put himself at the scene of the crime if he didn't need to? It has been suggested that there was an agreement that a hitman would kill V and then John would dispose of the body, but that just makes no sense whatsoever. There are other details which might make V's story unlikely too. She didn't say straight away that it was John that attacked her, it was only later when she claimed that she recognised his voice. How would she manage to fight back for any length of time too? She claimed that there was an altercation before she grabbed him and he let go of her, but she was a petite woman. John towered over her. I can't see any situation where she'd managed to overpower him enough to prevent him from just killing her within seconds. While we can only attempt to gauge the type of person John was from conflicting character descriptions, one thing that seems pretty certain is that John adored his children. If he planned to kill V, why would he do so when his children were in the house? They could have heard or seen it happening, which would not only traumatise them, but make them despise him, which he wouldn't have wanted. How could he even be sure that he wouldn't accidentally kill one of the kids instead? Police believe he mistook Sandra for V because the light bulb had been taken out so he couldn't see properly, so how would he know for sure that Sandra wasn't Frances? You'd think the footsteps would sound pretty different, but then everyone has their own walk on stairs. Surely he'd be familiar with V's steps, so how did he not realise that Sandra wasn't V? While Sandra and V were a similar height, Sandra's dress size was one size bigger than V, which might not sound much, but you can tell a difference in a size 8 and a size 10 or a size 12 and 14. It just seems unlikely that John could mistake V for his wife, who he'd been married to for 11 years. He would have had to get pretty close to Sandra to kill her in the way that he did, yet at no point before approaching her did he realise that she wasn't V. It's not even known for sure that the light bulb was taken out before Sandra's death. It could have been so she didn't see the attacker, but it also could have been taken out after to try and prevent anyone from seeing the body before it was hidden. And if John intended to kill V in the first place, why didn't he end up doing so? You might think that he was thrown off by the fact that he'd just killed the wrong person, but surely at that point he'd have even more motive to want V dead. He, in his own mind at least, had a reason to begin with. But now she'd just found out that he'd killed someone, why leave a witness that he was gonna kill anyway? Even if he decided against killing V, he could have fled the scene without talking or without taking off his mask so V wouldn't recognise him. If John did kill Sandra and attack V, surely he would have been covered in blood. But when Frances saw them enter the bedroom, she didn't notice any blood on him at all. Again, she was just a kid, experiencing something so traumatic could have clouded her memory, but her testimony does not support V's account for that night. Susan corroborated Frances's claims that there was no blood on John though, only stating that there was a damp patch on the right hip area of the trousers. You might be wondering if John changed or cleaned up before he arrived at Susan's. That would explain the damp patch. But if so, why did the letters he sent to Bill have blood on the envelopes? Forensic experts examined the chair that John sat in while visiting Susan and writing the letters, and no traces of blood were found. There were also none of John's fingerprints at the scene, though V claims that he wore gloves. So what forensic evidence is there tying John to this crime? The car that John was using contained blood which could have been a mix between Sandra and V's blood, but this couldn't be proven. And while it seems very likely, it can't even be proven that John was the person to leave the car there. An officer who featured in the BBC documentary said that while he believes John probably was guilty, he has his doubts as to whether John left the car in New Haven where it was eventually found. I'm not sure why he has his doubts, but I assume they must have some kind of information that's not public knowledge to suggest that John might not have left the car there. If someone else drove the car and left it there, that makes it pretty likely that John could have been framed for the murder. On the note of the car, I'm trying to work out how the bloodstains got in there. You'd expect it would be because John was covered in blood, but Frances and Susan both confirmed that that wasn't the case. And there was no type B blood found in the ground floor cloakroom where V said John was waiting for her, and none upstairs from when John took V upstairs. It's important to remember that due to forensic methods at the time, the blood in the car has not been confirmed to have belonged to Sandra or V. The blood groups matched, but there is a chance, maybe a small chance, that the blood was there for another reason entirely. I mentioned before that a lead pipe had been found in the boot of the car, but that pipe had no blood on it and clearly hadn't been used in the attack. Why would John leave the murder weapon at the scene but leave a very similar pipe in the boot of his car? At the inquest, the forensic expert said that if the pipe that was used in the murder and the pipe found in the boot of the car were from the same length, that they were never connected. This makes me wonder if the pipe used in the murder did belong to John, but that it was already in the house and could have been used by someone else. It does seem kind of unlikely. I mean, you'd think if someone was planning to murder someone that they'd probably bring their own weapon. But it's just strange that it couldn't be proven that the two pipes were cut from the same length, and that even if they were, they definitely weren't connected, so where was the rest of the pipe? The back door at the house was unlocked. V said this was because they weren't very burglar conscious back then, but she had had jewellery stolen from the house before. V claimed that she never went down into the basement, but a spot of blood from Group A was found down there. This could have potentially been from police contamination, but it's impossible to say. There was a small amount of type B blood, presumed to be Sandra's, on V, including on the sole of her shoe. This could have transferred from John when they were fighting. For example, if she kicked him, that would explain how it got on her shoe. But it could also add to the suggestion that V might have in fact entered the basement after Sandra's murder. Witness testimony tells us that John wasn't completely covered in blood. He may have had a small amount on his trousers that was later sponged off. But if there was only a small amount of blood on John, it's harder to understand how this could have transferred to V, particularly on the sole of her shoe. There were smears of type A blood on the outside of the sack that Sandra's body was in. Again, this could have been from accidental transfer, but V claims that she never went anywhere near the sack, and reporters claimed that the body was brought out in the sack wrapped in plastic. Parts of V's story are a little bit confusing too. For example, she stated that after the attack, John had walked her upstairs and then went into the bathroom to get a wet towel. In an interview, the way that V told that implied that John had gone into the bathroom right after lying her down on the bed, and that no significant amount of time passed before John left the room. However, according to the BBC documentary, John and V spent 40 minutes in the bedroom before John went into the bathroom and V escaped. Why, when given an account of the night, would V not mention those 40 minutes and what happened in them? Did they just sit there in silence, and if not, what did they talk about? It just seems a strange thing to miss out. Another detail that has me wondering if John might have been telling the truth is that he didn't try to hide the fact that he'd been in the house that night. If he stopped by the club to provide an alibi for himself, as police believe, he easily could have just claimed that he never went to the house that night. Think about it. Surely he'd have spent some time planning this night, and even if, as we have to assume, it didn't go to plan and he really did somehow accidentally kill Sandra rather than V, he could have then killed V, left the house, and pretended he was never even there. It's hard to believe that an intelligent, well-educated person wouldn't plan this better. This isn't solid proof or anything, but for what it's worth, John's children don't seem to believe he was guilty. His youngest daughter, Camilla, who is now a QC, said, "As a lawyer, I hope it's not old-fashioned to point out that my father never stood trial. It is unfortunate that he is regularly referred to, in almost factual terms, as a murderer. He has never been able to defend himself, and the evidence was not conclusive. It was circumstantial. V was estranged from her 3 children for more than 30 years, and she has never met her grandchildren. Her son George stated that V was able to live in her home rent-free in her later life under an arrangement with the family trust, which was put in place by him and his sisters. I can't seem to find a definite reason for V not having contact with her children. Maybe it was just because, as she admitted, she wasn't a great mum, or for another reason that we'll get onto soon. But considering we know that the children don't actively believe their dad was guilty, is it possible they may have thought V either lied or was mistaken, and hold some level of resentment towards her as a result? And if all that wasn't enough to at least make you slightly question the official story, V has changed various details of her story over the years. Most importantly, in 1981, V herself admitted that she couldn't be 100% sure that it was John who attacked her that night, telling News of the World, "I only know that at the time I thought my husband had hit me. I didn't think I had fallen, maybe I did. Maybe he had lifted me to my feet when I recovered consciousness. There could quite easily have been someone hiding downstairs or in the cloakroom." Given everything we've been through so far, it's not too far-fetched to suggest that V could have been mistaken about what really happened that night. Maybe someone else killed Sandra and attacked V, and when John came in to help, V, in a dazed state after just being hit over the head, just assumed that John was the attacker. There are no known alternative suspects to John, but it has been suggested that the police didn't fully investigate any other potential suspects, basically just having tunnel vision from the off. Sandra's estranged husband had an alibi for that night, and her other male friends were questioned and ruled out too. That's not to say that every other suspect could have been ruled out though. In 2012, a witness statement was uncovered from John's sister, Lady Sarah Gibbs, who told police at the time that John's daughters spoke about a boyfriend who lived in the home. It wasn't clear whether this was V's boyfriend or Sandra's, but it appears that this unidentified man was never questioned or ever considered a suspect. If the children were right, and there was a man living in or at least visiting the house frequently, how could police have overlooked him as a suspect? It has been suggested that Sandra could have gone downstairs to meet someone, possibly this unidentified man, and got into some kind of altercation. She went down 4 flights of stairs to the kitchen, which was unnecessary considering there was a kettle on the floor below V's bedroom. But what if this wasn't even a targeted attack, and maybe just a burglary gone wrong? The house had been burgled before, obviously no one had been harmed in the past, but that doesn't mean something couldn't have gone wrong this time. The last theory we're going to discuss is that V killed Sandra or hired someone to kill Sandra and tried to frame John for it. We've looked at some evidence and questionable details which might suggest that John wasn't actually responsible for this, but some of those details potentially point towards him actually being framed. If V did hire someone to kill Sandra, it's possible that while John was in the house, that this hitman might have then gone to plant evidence. But I just can't really think of a sequence of events for that to happen that doesn't really sound too far-fetched. That theory would also mean that V would have had to self-inflict her injuries, which weren't life-threatening, but they were more than just a bit of a scratch. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she didn't. I have heard of cases before where people were so dedicated to their false story that they were prepared to hurt themselves to make it look more believable. I'm not aware of any forensic evidence that would show that V or someone that V hired was responsible for the murder, but there isn't really much tying John to the crime either, and obviously police when investigating wouldn't have been looking for anything to tie V to the murder, so they'd be less likely to find it. There are a couple of debatably strange details that might make you wonder about V though. The fact that V left her kids in the house after getting attacked might mean something. If your husband went crazy, killed the nanny, then attempted to kill you, would you really leave your kids alone in the house with him so you could escape? This could link back to what I said before, that it didn't seem that V was particularly maternal, but it could also mean that she, or someone she hired, was responsible, so she knew the kids wouldn't be killed anyway. V stated in an interview in 1980 that she would have rather died that night than have the publicity that the family has faced since. When asked by the interviewer if she means she would have sacrificed her life for the reputation of the Lucan family, she says certainly. When asked why, she states, "I don't have a very high opinion of the value of human life," then explains that she had already fulfilled her biological function by having children, and that if it were better for them if she was killed, that's 4 people against 1. I don't want to take this too out of context, but that does seem a very practical, for lack of a better word, way of thinking about it. If she saw some practical reason for Sandra to die that outweighed, in V's mind, her right to live, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that she might have killed her. Maybe what V said was specific to herself, that she didn't value her own life very much, but she didn't really specify, and it's just a bit of a strange thing to say regardless. And there are other things that V said in interviews that make people wonder if she might be covering up. She has changed her mind on whether or not she thinks John's dead. One time she said that she believed he was dead and went on to detail a very specific way that he might have ended his own life, by jumping into the propeller of a boat. Another time she said that she had no reason to believe that he was dead, and if he walked through the door that she would be glad to see him. Now I can't really imagine being glad to see someone that murdered an innocent person and attempted to murder me too. Perhaps the most damning example of something that might make you question V's character is an incident that occurred only a few days before that night. I mentioned before that George Weiss thought John didn't seem himself the day before. He asked another friend, Stephen Raphael, if he knew why John was acting strangely, and Stephen said that John had bought a kitten for his children as a present because he knew they'd had a hard time. But a few hours after taking it over, it had been posted through his letterbox dead. He believed that V had killed the kitten, and at first I wondered if he might have jumped the gun accusing her, but according to the Express, not the most reputable source, but I'm only using the quote from V's friend, a close friend of Lady Lucan, who had been helping her complete her autobiography, said, "Veronica always felt very guilty about what happened with the kitten. It's why she could even forgive John, Lord Lucan, for going demented and being provoked to his bizarre actions. It also explains why the children turned against her, understandable in a way when you've been given a lovely pet and then your father tells you that it's been killed by your mad mother. At the time, John was genuinely worried that Veronica's mental instability made her unsuitable to look after the children. He was at his wit's end. Veronica was only too capable of killing the kitten. She could be cold and detached and was able to compartmentalise her emotions. There are two possible things that we can infer from this. The first being that John had possibly even more motive than we previously realised to want V dead. The second is that this says a lot about V as a person. She admitted herself she can be cold, but this is kinda next level. I mean, who kills a kitten then posts it through a letterbox? Especially when it had been given to her children as a present to help cheer them up after everything they'd been through. This just really doesn't sit right with me. We all know that harming animals is a pretty big red flag. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove that she framed John for murder, but it certainly shows that she hated him enough to. The theory that V framed John for murder does sound pretty extreme, but then so does killing a kitten and posting it through a letterbox. If V was responsible for Sandra's death, there is no proven motive directly related to Sandra. Various rumours have circulated, including the possibility that Sandra and John were having an affair, though I couldn't find any information to suggest that was anything more than a rumour. We do know that after V and John broke up, he was in contact with one of the nannies and was basically trying to get dirt on V. Maybe the same thing was happening with Sandra. Even if they didn't have any kind of romantic relationship, they could have had an arrangement where Sandra would feed him information that he could use against V. V could have found this out and then killed Sandra in a fit of rage. But this isn't proven, it's just speculation, which unfortunately is what most of this seems to be, no matter what version of events you believe. While we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, Sandra's family reported that they believed that Sandra and V had a good working relationship. While there could have been motives that we aren't aware of, if V did kill Sandra, it does seem possible that it might have been more about framing John than it was actually wanting Sandra dead. Some people wonder why John would disappear if he was innocent, but if he was so convinced that he would be framed for the murder, there's an obvious reason. If you believe that V was actually responsible for Sandra's death though, you might consider the possibility that she also got rid of John. If V had a motive to want to make Sandra disappear, it's likely that this had something to do with John, so it stands to reason that she'd also want him gone. John can't have been killed straight after it all happened though, as he spoke to his mother on the phone and visited Susan after the incident. So if John was killed, he would have to be tracked down after he left Susan's. It's not impossible that V managed to contact him somehow and lured him to meet her under false pretenses, and it's not even beyond the realms of possibility that Susan could have been in on all this too, and that maybe John didn't even visit her that night. If so, the suggestion that V forced John to call his mother and give her a false account of the night, and that she forced him to write those letters, would seem more possible. Some people have pointed out that the content of the letters seems a little bit odd coming from someone that had just accidentally killed the nanny rather than the wife. One of the letters was about John's finances, and if he planned to end his own life or run away, why would he even be bothered about that? But if V did force him to write those letters and to call his mother, you'd think that she would make him confess in them, if the plan all along was to frame him for murder. I think it's more likely that he voluntarily disappeared out of fear that he'd be convicted of a crime that he may or may not have committed. But it is a complete mystery what actually happened to John after that night. It's been suggested that he ended his own life, but no body has ever been found. Some believe that because John had friends in high places, that they might have helped him escape. There have been countless sightings of him, none of which have been confirmed, all around the world. In Africa, India, the Maldives. One of the more recent sightings claim he was found living as a Buddhist monk in Australia. But these supposed sightings always turn out to be either completely made up, or the person is located and it turns out that they're not John. Every couple of years you can bet on the Sun or the Daily Mail writing an article claiming he's been found, but as of now there are no credible leads. John left his passport behind, but it's not impossible that his friends could have gotten him a fake passport or something. Personally, I think it's more likely that he took his own life. The letter he wrote to his friend Michael before he disappeared read, "My dear Michael, I have had a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidences. However, I won't bore you with anything or involve you except to say that when you come across my children, which I hope you will, please tell them that you knew me and that all I cared about was them. The fact that a crooked solicitor and a rotten psychiatrist destroyed me between them will be of no importance to the children. I gave Bill Shan Kidd an account of what actually happened, but judging by my last effort in court, no one, let alone a 67-year-old judge, would believe, and I no longer care, except that my children should be protected. Yours ever, John. That letter itself poses more questions. Who is the crooked solicitor and rotten psychiatrist? The solicitor that failed him in court, or the one that led V to win? Is the psychiatrist he refers to whoever determined that V was fit to look after the children? Either way, he speaks of himself in the past tense, such as I cared rather than I care, which could suggest that he was planning to leave and never come back. But it could also mean that he knew he wouldn't be alive soon. John taking his own life or running away to start a new life are the two main theories, but there are also some other pretty wild ones, such as John planned to run away and asked his friends for help, and they killed him for whatever reason, maybe because he owed them money or something. Another theory was that John's friend, John Aspinall, who owned the Claremont Club, had John's body eaten by tigers at his zoo, so it would never be found. It's all just more speculation though. While friends, family and the general public have their own conflicting theories, no one truly knows what happened to Lord Lucan. He was declared legally dead in 1999 and a death certificate was issued in 2016, allowing his son to take his title as Lord Lucan. V took her own life in 2017 at the age of 80 after self-diagnosing herself with Parkinson's disease. It turned out she didn't have Parkinson's, but she had implied years earlier that she would take her own life anyway before she became too frail to do anything. She did not leave her children anything in her will, and at the time of her death had not been in contact with her children for 30 years. Anyway, I feel like I've probably rambled enough, so I think it's probably about time to start wrapping this video up, but I really wanted to make sure that I included all the main details as well as many of the details that are often overlooked. As for my opinion on what happened, I think V's version of events is probably the easiest to believe and debatably the least contrived, but I'm still not 100% convinced. I think V probably hated John enough to frame him for something like this, but I don't think there's enough evidence to say that she was actually responsible for Sandra's death in some way. I also just can't think of a feasible way that that could have happened, which explains all the evidence. But I think the same can be said for John. Most of the evidence is circumstantial and relies on V's testimony. John never got a chance to fully tell his side of the story and to explain the evidence against him. I do think it's quite plausible that V could have got it wrong and that someone else killed Sandra for whatever reason and attacked V. It's possible that John happened to walk past at that time and tried to help V and she just assumed it was him that attacked her, or she knew it wasn't John but said it was him anyway. I watched a documentary that's available on YouTube, Lord Lucan, My Husband, The Truth, which is basically the story from V's perspective. Had I just seen that and nothing else, I would probably totally believe V's story. I could be wrong, and sometimes people are just good at putting on an act, but I felt like she was being pretty honest in what she said. I think V's descriptions of the few occasions where John was abusive to her was believable. She didn't make it sound too dramatic and at times almost minimised what he did, such as when he hit her with a cane and she said he probably could have done it harder. But inevitably, she told a pretty biased story and obviously neglected to mention some of her own mistakes, such as the incident with the kitten, which is just shocking to be honest. I can believe that John might not have been the best husband and was probably more interested in gambling than his wife. But it sounds like they were both pretty cold towards each other and probably just weren't that well suited when they really got to know each other. There's never been any dispute that John was a good father and deeply cared about his children, which makes me wonder if he was as cold as V made him out to be. In the documentary, she said she fell in love with Greville partly because he was more sensitive and more like a human than John, but by all accounts, V herself wasn't sensitive, even with her children, and lacked emotion. I'm not disputing or condoning John being violent on 3 or so occasions that V mentioned. There's no excuse for that, but considering what happened with the kitten, I think it's safe to assume that V herself had some violent tendencies. So I don't really know what to make of all this. This video has taken the longest out of any to research and write notes for, and throughout it I just keep changing my mind. I think I'll be set on one theory and then I'll find another piece of information that just totally changes my mind. When discussing cases like this and theorising who did it, it's easy to get wrapped up in the mystery and forget that there was an innocent victim at the centre of all this. Sandra was only 29 years old when she was murdered, and she left behind 2 children. Whoever took her life, whether that was John, V, or someone else entirely, they never faced justice, and Sandra's family have had to live with that for nearly 50 years. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think was responsible for Sandra's murder, and what happened to John afterwards? If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.